want to record this?
Let's see
it's
here.
recording now. I had issues with it.
Okay.
I just started. Thank you.
So the nice thing about dashboards is it brings together a lot of different points of view into one consolidated view, right? So, for example, a typical dashboard is something like this, where you have metrics on one column, and then how many new customers you had today, how many new customers this week, this month, this quarter, this year, as well as with orders and order dollars. Now, something like this would normally take many reports to do. One report for new customers, and then you would probably have to query the report for today, this week, and so forth. And when you have a dashboard, it brings together what I like to describe the health of the company, so that the owner or the managers can look at the dashboard and then further investigate if you see something that's out of whack. And so usually what occurs over time is they look at this dashboard and they get a sense of how the business works. And so if they're used to seeing, for example, one customer a week, and then all of a sudden they're getting 5 customers a week, they might want to find out why we're getting more customers, or the other way around, where you usually get 5 customers a week and now it drops to 1 or 2. Why is it we're not getting enough new customers every week when I'm used to seeing around 5 a week? So a dashboard is just a way to be able to get critical metrics on a business and then further investigate. The joke around the office also is, if you see the dashboard, everything's okay, you can go golfing that day. So in terms of, in terms of dashboards, it helps you spot trends and determine if something's wrong, which I like about them a lot. So going back to our example, if you were to run a query for each one of these metrics, you're talking about 15 queries. And sometimes you're able to consolidate multiple queries into one, but multiple outputs into one. But in general, you're looking at a lot of queries that you would need to do in order to bring all this similar information together. Now, if you have a database with 5,000, 10,000 records, it's no big deal. Access would crush through that in no time for these 15 queries. But if you're looking at a database with 100,000 records, 500,000 records, 1 million records, or even millions of records, trying to get this kind of analysis done with Access is just going to be too slow. It's going to get bogged down. It's going to bog down the Access file itself, and people will not want to run the dashboard if it's going to be too long. So the combination of SQL Server Access is ideal for something like this, where you can offload this processing to SQL Server Store Procedure, and then just use a startup form in Access that sends a date to the Store Procedure, and have the Store Procedure then calculate all the metrics, appropriate metrics, and return it back as one record set back to Access. So I'm going to show you what I have ready. I created the Northwind dashboard, and I took the Northwind database, and I created the SQL Server database out of it. Let me just disconnect and reconnect. See if I can show what I'm talking about. All right, so here I created this Northwind dash, and I have these files for you. And I'll show you where those files are located at the end of the presentation. So you can just focus on the presentation now. But what I did was I basically took the Northwind database and Access and uploaded it to SQL Server. And then now I have all the data of all different tables in it. Then I created a store procedure that calculates my dashboard for me. So if you look at this, this is the store procedure dashboard. And in here, you notice at the top I have a parameter for date time called user start date. And you'll see how that works in the how the start date can be used to vary the analysis. And so, for example, if I want to see a dashboard from yesterday, and so today I can change the date and it'll recalculate for me. Now, when you have a situation like this, where you got 15 queries coming from a wide range of tables, it really does behoove you to have a store procedure that will allow you to store this data as you're iterating through the different tables and different queries. So, for example, if I show you this store procedure, you're going to see that it's going through a series of calculations for year, quarter start date, and then it starts calculating. So this is one query here, this is another query here, another query. And, you know, when you have, when you're querying different tables, in this case, for example, this first one up here, I'm querying the customers table, customers. But later on down there in the bottom, I'm querying the orders table. Well, what I do here is I aggregate the results of these queries under a table that is in memory called a table variable. So here, instead of like a normal variable, like we might say integer, for example, you would say declare my orders int. Here, I'm declaring a table, and then immediately after the declaration, I'm specifying what the layout of that table is. Now, most of the time at IT Impact, we're working with SQL Server Express. And there's three issues with SQL Server Express. There's the memory issue. Does anybody know how much gigabytes of RAM SQL Server Express will use, no matter how many gigs of RAM is on the server?
4 gigs,
I have no clue.
1 gigabyte, right? So you can have an 8 gigabyte server, and SQL Server Express would limit itself to 1 gigabyte because they want you to buy the full version. They're not dumb. Microsoft wants you to have a taste of the good life, and then hopefully you'll go in and buy the $12,000 version of SQL Server. The other aspect of this is no matter how many CPUs you have in that machine, it's only going to use 1 CPU, and the size of the database can only be 11 gigabytes. And by the way, in all our time in creating solutions for our clients, we've never had a client had to migrate from SQL Server Express to a full license because the database size was too big. And SQL Server does a wonderful job of optimizing space, and it does a much better job of doing that than Access ever did. So that that database that's 1 gigabyte of space in Access might be just a few hundred megabytes in SQL Server. But in this case, you could have gone 2 routes. I created a table variable here called dashboard, and I specified the 3 columns. My metric, which is what you see here in this example where you have new customers, new orders, and order dollars. And then you have the time frame that I'm using today, this week, this month, and then the actual metric itself, right? Now I'm using money, so I'm using the money variable to store not just dollars, but also quantities, right? So quantity of new customers, quantity of new orders, and then order dollars. All right, so once I do that, then I start with my queries. I calculate a series of dates, right? So my start date, my end date, and then I got year, quarter, and quarter start date, quarter end date, and then I calculate these dates based on the date that's supplied. I'm not going to get too much detail here, but this is some great calculations that are going to help you with other projects. This is a topic for another presentation, all these date calculations. So it's suffice to say that once I have all my dates specified, now I'm ready to query, because I'll probably query the database for new customers today, right? So that'll be where customer date created equal today, right? And then I'll use the same start date for number of orders created today. So the fact is that you've got the same dates I'm using over and over again. So I calculate their dates once, and I don't have to worry about it again. Now, I mentioned to you when I first started this conversation that there's another way of doing this. I may have mentioned this to you. This table variable is a table variable that's in memory. I could have just easily done this by creating a temporary table in SQL Server, which would use the temporary DB. Now, under normal SQL Server conditions, a temporary table is stored to where? Where is that data stored? In temporary DB, right? And where is temporary DB located? Is it located in the hard drive of the server, or is it located in memory?
No idea.
It's in the hard drive of the server. So anytime you create a temporary table in your store procedure in SQL Server, it's going to write to the hard drive. And if it's not a solid state hard drive, that means it's going to take longer to store your data versus storing it in a table variable like this. This table variable is stored in memory. Now, granted, if your table variable is too big or has too much data, it'll cache the hard drive anyway. So what I always urge people to do is to try it both ways. This way I have here, which is with a table variable, or with a temporary table in a TempDB, and I'll give you an example of that here in a second. So let's go through my first query. So this is a good example. So this is where I am querying for today how many customers were created today, right? And I say insert into dashboard, which is my table. So I use a simple insert into query to my dashboard table that's in memory. And I just query the customer's table with today's date. So I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to start a new query in SQL Server. I'm going to paste this in here. And then, and I only copy certain information. Let me go back. All right. Just want to prove my point here. So instead of doing the insert into, if you want to do the temporary database, you would just say select and then your fields, and then of course you would specify a new table here using the into clause. Does anybody know how you specify a temporary table name? It has to have what character at the beginning of the name of the table. Does anybody know that?
Sign.
Pound sign, yeah, the hash, right? Very good. So here I'm going to say dashboard. And now what I've done is I've used my first query to create that temporary table. And then, of course, I would have to use, in this case, my first query would have to say as metric, right, and so forth. So I would have to have the as keyword and then with the name of the column for each one of these so that it creates a table. And then I can use that insert statements just like I do here going forward. Instead of dashboard with the at, leave a dashboard with the pound. Now, the only reason I say this is, you probably wonder why I'm so specific. If you have for example, Ben was saying he's got an application that's used by 100 users. If you have 100 people start up the Access database, that's 100 dashboards that will be calculated throughout the day. And now you're running into performance issues with SQL Server because it's querying the same tables over and over again to create 100 different dashboards. And so what you want to do is you want to try both methodologies, using both a memory variable, like I have in this store procedure, or using a temporary table in TempDB. You'd be surprised. Sometimes one approach is faster than the other. And the other aspect of this is, if you got 100 people querying this database for a dashboard, you may want to make the dashboard optional. So if they want to see the dashboard, they just press the button to see the dashboard as opposed to serving up the dashboard right away when they open the application, like my example is going to show you here in a minute. So it all depends on your particular set of circumstances how you want to approach that. Now the rest of the store procedure, which by the way, you're going to get a copy of this as part of the file dump. The rest of the store procedure is very similar. I'm just running query after query. I'm storing these results into dashboard table variable. And then at the end of this, after I've done all that, is I'm going to return back to Access the results of that dashboard here. So that's what, if you've never done store procedures, you know, if unless you end it with a select statement, it's not going to return back any data to Access, right? Always important that you return back some data on there.
Can I interrupt with a question?
Sure.
Okay, so if I have that dashboard returned to me in Access, and I use that as a record set for my form, does the dashboard remain active in the SQL Server's memory until I close the dashboard?
Oh, that's a great point. So in this case, the dashboard that you're talking about is only available during the session time. So let's talk about that, how that works. In this case, I'm actually showing you here. When I launch my application, I actually show the user a dashboard. So what happens is I open the form, it queries the database, retrieves the data via a pass-through query, and then I display this data to the user. Once the pass-through query is done, that data is destroyed. So the dashboard only exists in SQL Server for that session time for that user. So if you were to have, for example, 20 users start up the application at exactly the same time, there would be 20 copies of the dashboard in the SQL Server memory, one for each user. And as soon as the store procedure gets finished execution, it gets erased from SQL Server memory.
Thank you. That answers my questions very nicely. Thank you.
Okay, so this is not much of a dashboard because when I first gave this presentation, I did it in 2014. And so let me just check what date that was. It looks like it was around 11/17. So let me try 11/17, 2014. So this is where the nice argument comes into play, where I can specify an argument and then see a dashboard for that day. And now I've got more statistics like this month, new orders this week, and so forth. And so one of my points is when you create a store procedure in SQL Server, and I realize this is not a store procedure chat, but when you have a store procedure like this, the first thing you want to do is test it in SQL Server first, make sure it works fine in your SQL Server, and then try using it in Access. So again, the way you would test this is you would just say exec, and then the name of the procedure. And I always use USP underscore to name my store procedure. Does anybody know why we use USP as opposed to SP?
SP is the more standard to their own, isn't it?
Yeah, so
SP is what Microsoft uses.
Exactly. So to avoid having a store procedure in your database conflict with a Microsoft store procedure, you want to start with the USP. Very good. Thank you, sir. So then I put in my date. I think it was the 17th or 14th. Then I highlight the statement, and I run it.
You've got quotes.
Oh, sorry. Yes. I got quotes. All right. And there's my data. Now notice that the data comes back in this case as 3 columns and not that nice looking dashboard. And so I'll show you how I convert that over using a cross-stack query. But my point here is when I used to teach Access, and I always told my students when you create a query, you want to know what the answer is before you pose a question. And so as programmers, when you create a new store procedure like this, you actually want to make sure that you do know indeed that it was 12 new customers this quarter, and it was 29 customers this year, and so forth, so that when you query the store procedure, you can double check the stored procedure. So know the answer before you pose a question when you're testing your stored procedures and queries, and that way you can validate your stored procedures before you start using them in Access. So now that I've validated the stored procedure is correct, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how it actually launches this this dashboard on the main menu of the form. Basically, this form has a data source, which is dashboard crosstab. So I'm going to show you this crosstab query. And this crosstab query, in turn, has a pass-through query associated, which is query dashboard. I'm going to show you that next. So it's query dashboard. And all this is exact same syntax that I just used on the server in a pass-through query. So whatever you type into SQL Server Management Studio is what you would use here. So I got the exact USB dashboard with the date, and then I've got my connection string to create the pass-through query. Now, when I launch the form, the main menu form with the dashboard on there, I have a little startup procedure in the form itself, which I'll see on the open event, that actually modifies the dashboard query. I created this procedure here called modified dashboard query, and all this does is defines the syntax of the SQL with the date that's supplied, which is today's date when it starts up, and then it opens that QDF, sets the SQL to that QDF, and then sets the QDF to nothing. So in real time, it's going in there and it's modifying this pass-through query with 11.17.14. So I'm going to show you how that works real quick, and then we'll talk about the crosstab query. So I'm going to break my procedure, and then I'll run the form. And so it sets the date to 1/7/2015. So I press F8. And I need to, I'm on a Windows 8 laptop, so let me pull down the function key. And then it's going to execute this procedure. Defines the SQL store procedure with the right syntax, which is with today's date, and then it opens that QDF, which I forgot to hold on the shift function key. And then because the store procedure is based on the crosstab query, it automatically goes and gets fetched that data. So now, if I open this dashboard query, it's going to have today's date on there as opposed to 11/17/14. All right. So the crosstab query is just a query that just takes those three columns and converts them over to a format that my dashboard can recognize, right? So I'm always going to have these columns about new columns coming in. And all I did was I set the forms record source to the crosstab query, and then if I put this in the design view, you'll see the you'll see that it has the my metric today and this week and so forth, which is just like the crosstab query. You know, usually when you use crosstab queries in Access, you have to worry about some columns dropping off. But in this case, I'm always going to query for today, this week, this month, this quarter, this year. And so they always show up, and I don't have to worry about any complex code that will interfere with, that has to take into account any new columns that might show up in my crosstab query. So it's a pretty simple concept. You know, you create a store procedure, that's going to bring back the metrics that your client wants to see day in and day out for the business. And then you use a pass-through query. Obviously, you would need to know what the connection string is in order to make it work. Let me see if I can bring that up. Properties. All right, so you got to, of course, know. I use a DSN for Northwind Dash. And then once you do that, then you, like in my case, I created a cross-type query. You don't have to do it that way, but I created a cross-type query. And then I bind the cross-type query to the form. Then I use the onOpen event of the form to modify that cross-type query. I'm sorry, to modify the pass-through query data source with the right date. Now, what happens is that when you enter a different date, it just executes that the same procedure, and that's why I separated it, right? Let me show you what I'm talking about. So here is that date field, and you'll notice that it just goes in and runs that dashboard query after the update of the date. So I should probably have added some code there saying if the date is null, then don't run the modified dashboard query, but this is for demo purposes only. All right, so dashboards are wonderful. They're great. They do require some more work up front, but usually what happens is people love the concept, and I use that to upsell my practice, right? So once I hit them up with some demos of work that we've done, and they've agreed to a price, and I'll do is I'll upsell them. I'll say, well, for a few more dollars, we can do this dashboard. Oh, yeah, that looks great. Definitely want to see a dashboard. That's going to help you. And, of course, I sell it, so it's going to help you identify trends in your business with ease, be able to look into issues and further investigate those, and on it goes, right? So I do a good job of selling. I'm the sales guy in my company, so this is what I do for a living. But other than increasing the sales of my company, it's also a great tool for my clients if they know how to use it. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to open up for questions here.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
I'm still quite new to using SQL Server with Access, and as I've been using it with Access, as I've been using an Access backend, if you have a form with the record set will automatically refresh and check if any changes have been made to the underlying data. Does the same happen with SQL Server? If the Access form is bound to a SQL Server table, will it refresh?
No, not the same thing as Access, right? There needs to be a refresh event. And refresh event is when you press F5 to requery the form. Sometimes when you add a record to using the form or edit a record, that's when it might refresh the form data. So it's a good question because it does not behave exactly the same way when it's an Access backend.
Okay.
The other thing is you probably want to know if you can use a stored procedure as a record source for a form. Have you ever pondered that situation?
I have pondered, yes. I haven't tried it yet.
Okay, so you're probably familiar with the limitations. The only way to do a stored procedure as a record source is by creating a pass-through query with the stored procedure, and it's all read-only. You can't change the data.
Okay. So that's a problem.
So it's great for this example where it's a dashboard. You're not going to be modifying the data dashboard. So it's great for this, and it's great for a report, which you're not going to be modifying the data too. But I've also used it for search forms. So if I create a search form for customers or orders where data is not going to be updated, it's great for that. But other than that, you need to use either a view or a direct link to the table.
So if you have a SQL Server backend, is there a difference between doing in code doing a me.refresh versus a me.requery?
No, there's no difference. It's the same thing. I think with the refresh, I believe with the refresh and requery, it's still going to go out and query the SQL Server.
So in the example you have where you modify the date in your dashboard form, if you replace the me.requery with the me.refresh, would it still use the change date?
Well, let's take a look. Let me see if I may have speaking out of turn, but let's just try it and see how it works. So I'll just change this date. And I just want to make sure that I close these in case that causes a problem. All right. So I got that closed. Yep, it does make a difference. I'll take that back. So the me.refresh is not the same thing as me.requery.
Okay, that's nice to know.
So I changed the me.requery, and I'm going to change this here. Yeah, definitely not the same thing. It's really a wonderful experience to learn SQL Server and be able to upsize your application in SQL Server, because SQL Server has so much more to offer than a regular backend. So I hope I wish you the best with that, and I hope that you become a convert just like I did when I first got started on this journey of using SQL Server with Access.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some things I really love about it, especially if I have complex queries that could have taken maybe 10 seconds in Access. I don't have all that much data, but 10 seconds is still just too long a wait for me. And using the SQL Server is just really snappy. It's like 0.1 seconds instead of 10 seconds. So that part is great. But I'm still struggling with a lot of my code. I have a very code-intensive database, a lot of operations going on. Some of it is within transactions, and all of this stuff I've had to migrate to SQL Server. That's been, I don't say it's terribly difficult, but it is a learning experience at the same time as just being time-consuming.
Yeah, you know, I think what happens is you get better at it as you do more and more projects. So I do encourage you to keep at it. Don't give up on it. And I think what you'll find is not only on the speed, but also the capabilities of being able to do so much more things with SQL Server than you can with Access, especially when it comes to data sets. The ability to query multiple sources in one giant query, I think is going to is a real joy with SQL Server.
One of the things I've been using is a common table expression, which Ben Clothier, also from IT Impact, helped me with, and that is just awesome. I'm using it to query the same table as in a parent-child relationship, and it can be any number of levels deep. And with Access, I had to query the first level, and then the second level, and the third level, and continue until there were no more children left in the relationship. With a common table expression in SQL Server, it's one query, and it's 100 or 1,000 times faster.
Wow, you see now you see what I'm saying. That SQL Server does make it a game changer.
Yeah, I just have to get used to it. I'm not saying I'm going back. I'm just, at this point, I guess I'm just saying I wish that I had started using SQL Server at the beginning of the project and not in the middle of the project.
Good, good. Well, you know, one of the things that also SQL Server brings to the table, besides speed and CTEs and computations, is security. I'll give you an example of that. So many times I've walked into a new client, and I see credit card information or employee social security numbers, which I use here in the U.S. to open credit card accounts. stored in Access with no password, no security whatsoever. And as a consultant, it falls upon me to educate the customer and say, look, you got this sensitive information. It needs to be on SQL Server. And I'll actually type a letter and mail it to them so that I'm on record saying that I told them it needs to be on SQL Server, as opposed to Access, where an employee who wants to do malicious things with that data can just simply copy to a thumb drive and take it home with them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I love Access, but there's some things I wouldn't store in Access. And credit card and social security information is definitely part of it.
Well, these guys were storing the credit card number, the 3-digit code on the back, the billing address. I mean, if I were a hacker, it would have been a gold mine.
I walked into a company once, and they had another Access database assigned by someone else, and I just opened the database, and I noticed it had a user table, and I'm poking around. I open up the user table. Notice it has a password field. It just has an input mask set to password. So I removed the input mask, and all of the passwords are there in plain text. And I just take the first one, I pop it in, log out of my current user account, type in the user's name and credentials, and now I have access to his user account. And probably, I don't know, somewhere between 50 and 90% of all of those passwords stored there are identical to the user's own passwords for their user accounts. And I immediately told the client as well, you have a problem here. This is not good.
Well, did you recommend SQL Server in that instance?
Well, I didn't know about SQL Server at the time. What I did recommend them was to simply use simply identify the user logging in as the user having logged into the computer. They didn't need to store passwords. I think that's another really good rule. Don't store information unless you actually need to.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's important. That particular case where the credit card numbers were the database, they had credit cards from 5 years ago. I mean, those credit cards are no longer valid, but still, what I told the client is, why do you need the credit card? Oh, because we need to charge for the tickets because they were a theater company. I says, well, when you finish charging the tickets, just store the last 4 digits in the database. So the customer calls and asks, what credit card do you use for this? You can say, well, we're not authorized to give you the whole number. We can just tell you what the last 4 digits were of your credit card that were used for this transaction.
Exactly. I would not trust a company that is actually storing my credit card information any longer than it needed to. I'd actually prefer it unless it's a really big company, if they outsource it to a professional credit card charging company.
Okay. Well, if you're starting out with SQL Server, I do have a collection of posts that I'd like to recommend, and you probably heard me say this before, but it bears repeating. If you want to learn more about SQL Server getting started, please visit my Get Started page, Start Here page. It's at AccessExperts.com, Start Here. And these are just a collection of posts that I feel will help you, along with a video of how to get started with SQL Server. The other thing is, when you have a SQL Server backend of more than a million records, there is a known issue trying to find records in SQL Server and Access. So, say for example, you got a 5 million record database in SQL Server, and you're trying to locate, and they're all patients, right? So you got 5 million patient records. If you're trying to locate Joe Smith using a form record set, it will never work. You have to use the Control-F methodology. So, for example, if you're at any field in Access, you can press Control-F to find that record. This is the only way you can find that record when you have a large back-end database. So just to keep that in mind.
Just to make sure I understood that correctly, if I had a search form returning a record set, I'd be able to find it, right?
That's different. Yeah, that's different. But if you, for example, You know, example, some clients need to be able to have access to all 5 million records, right? Because usually when I pop the form in the database, I use the where clause or the do command open form, and I limit that form to just one record, the one you need at that moment. But this client insisted that they needed to be able to use any record in the database at any time, be able to go to any of the 5 million records. Well, if it's a patient form, which you know, you can, when you load the form and you look at the bottom of the records and you come in here and you go to the end, you'll see 5 million at the bottom there. You know, they want to be able to find somebody using Control F, which works. It may take forever, but it does work. In your code, you wouldn't use Control F. You would probably use a record set clone of the form and then use the bookmark property. That doesn't work with that many records. You have to use the find method instead of the form. Just something to keep in mind.
That's interesting. Do you know that the 1 million is that like a set number or?
No, I mean Access will work with a SQL database of any size, whether it be 1 trillion records or 100,000 records. It doesn't matter. Right? There is no set limit because it doesn't download the data to the client. Right? So if you bind the form to a 1 trillion record table, which God help you if you do, but if you did, it's not like it's going to crash Access because it's only going to show you one record at a time.
Okay, I have another question for you. It's quite unrelated to this, but if you have a SQL Server backend, is there still a need to compact and repair the front end?
No, unless you're doing temporary tables, and that's one of my posts here. Let me see if it's one of my posts here. My post. Here. You see this post here? Create temporary tables and access with SQL data. Or if you're creating temporary tables and then deleting them and creating them, you're going to blow up the Access front end.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What usually happens in our case is people love the work we do, and they hire us to add more things over time. So we have frequent updates throughout the year, and I don't worry about it because the next update is going to come along and it's going to be a send down file.
Yeah, I know. I have the same. Too many updates to worry about.
So, well, those are all great questions. Anybody else have a question? Ray,
yeah,
Ben?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
You can hear me, right?
Yes.
I've got queries in Access that are nested to many, many levels because I want to normalize the data sometimes for reporting, and I don't want to reuse. I want to reuse the queries, and I end up nesting them many times. So if I want to migrate something like that to SQL Server, do I just make views that call other views? What's the best practice?
All right, so that's a great question, and so that's where the CTE that Ambrose and I were talking about, which is, I believe the C stands for Common Table Expression. And so, yes, views would work. I mean, don't get me wrong. You could have nested views, and that will work. You want to make sure, however, that you do a couple things. Number one, learn how to use Control-L. Do you guys know what Control-L is?
I couldn't hear that.
Learn how to use Control-L.
L as in lollipop?
Yes. And I'll show you what that does. And in this case, I have a very simple select statement, right? And it's going to query on date created. So I'll just delete that. When I press Control-L,
there again.
Doggone it. I might have to follow my quote guy. All right, so when I use Control-L, I highlight the whole query, press Control-L, and that will analyze the query for me and give me the execution plan. And then from there, it will Well, it wants the into dashboard. Let me get that out of there. And then from there, it will actually tell me if I'm missing an index down here. If this were a view, complex view, and I needed an index, it will actually tell me if you create this index, the view will be 90% faster. And it will actually give you the syntax to create the index. And then once you create the index, you come back and do Control-L, and you iterate through it until it's been completely optimized for all the indexes. Now, that's not exact science. A lot of SQL Server guys will scoff at that, but for us Access developers, it's manna from heaven. And because it does improve your performance by several levels of factors here. And I'll give you a better example of that. Let me bring up a more complex database I have here. This is a good one. Let's see here. Let's bring up this view. All right. Well, this was usually a partition. So let me try. Let's see here. Here. Let's try this view. Well, this is just one table, but you know, if I had a view with multiple tables, with multiple relationships, inner outer joins, it would actually create, it'll analyze and tell me, hey, you know, you're probably better off with this index to improve performance. So this is a good example, right? I have all these tables here, right, in this view. So what I do is once I create the view, I'll take the SQL syntax down here, and I'll press Control-A to highlight all, and then Control-C, then come over to my window, open window here, and then I'll just replace all this with the view syntax. And now that I've highlighted that, got to change the database to the right database. Now I've highlighted all that. Now I can press Control-L, and it will tell me, you know what, down here would have told me if I needed an index. So that's how I make sure I have the right indexes in place. Because, you know, when Access, we're so used to having Access create the index when the field name ends with ID, right? So if I'm in the order items table, I'll have a column called order ID, and Access will automatically create that index. Well, it doesn't do that in SQL Server. Right? If I migrate from Access to SQL Server, it does do that. But if I design the table in SQL Server, it won't add an index to any field ending with ID. I need to add those indexes manually. And so I may forget, or I may forget to add an index for a relationship between, and Control-L really does help me. Now, what I'd like to do now is have an in-depth discussion on this execution plan for the next 45 minutes. You guys ready?
I'm ready.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, sure. Execution plans are like bad medicine. We all need them, but nobody likes to analyze them. All right, so, you know, I always warn people, I'm not a SQL Server expert. I never pretend to be one. What I am is an expert between Access and SQL, the interaction of Access and SQL Server, and how to optimize that relationship. Okay, so that's one thing, right? You create the views and then you chain them, right? So unfortunately, when you chain them, it's gotta do one view, then the next view, and the other view, right? But then you have the other option, which is a CTE that my colleague recommended here, and he uses CTEs, and basically what that is, it's a way to define a data set in a database and then query against that data set.
It's useful if you have to query against it multiple times, right?
What was that?
The CTE is most useful if you have to query multiple times against the same data set, right?
So I think what the CTE affords you is the ability to fetch that data optimally and then do the analysis against that data. So in your case, you know how you have nested views? Well, you need to really try it both ways. I always preface sometimes discussions like this because some people quote me and says, Juan said CTEs are always going to be faster. I never said that. What I said was you got to make sure you run it both ways to see what the optimal performance, because every situation is different.
Okay, I have another question then, actually related to this. If I have to say, a view and a stored procedure, how do I compare the efficiency of those two to each other?
A view versus a stored procedure?
Or two stored procedures versus each other. I mean, when I look here, I can see that this query took 0.00.00 seconds to execute. But sometimes you might have queries that have to be run 1,000 times or 10,000 times, and suddenly it starts to make a difference even on the last digit of time used. How can I be more precise in the time used?
Well, that's a great question. And what happens with SQL Server is if you start running the same query over and over and over again, it'll start recognizing that. And honestly, that's what happens when you have a dashboard, right? You have it notices that 100 people watch the dashboard and 100 of them use the same query, select star from orders, what order date equal to today. And SQL Server will start caching the execution plan in memory. And that's why what happens, sometimes you have this very complex query. The first time you run it, it took 0 minutes with 3 seconds. And you start pressing F5 to execute this, and it starts with 2 seconds, and then 1 second, then it starts to 0 because it's caching internally the execution plan. And so it starts optimizing and serving up things. This is something that does automatically. That's why it's just a wonderful product.
So where does that put me in terms of trying to compare and find out which stored procedure is the most efficient?
Okay, so what you want to do is you want to execute both stored procedures and see down here at the bottom, the 000, right? So you execute one stored procedure, and it may take 3 seconds, and then the other stored procedure 2 seconds, and then you can determine that way. But when you have a stored procedure that takes 3 seconds, that may sound like quick, but if you repeat that over 1,000 times through the day, it'll start bogging you down, right? And so you need to come up with an alternative methodology to achieve the same results that won't bog down your server when it's running the same stored procedure over and over again. And granted, it will cache the execution plan, and it'll do a better job every time you run it, but it's not infinite, right? There's a curve, elliptical curve, where it comes up against this wall and it won't do any better after that.
Okay.
I've had instances where I develop an application on my desktop, works great, and then I go deploy it, works crappy. And so we get a lot of calls from people around the U.S. that want us to upsize their database to SQL Server. And one of the things that I always, Lucy and I both work on these calls. There's one of the things I always make clear with the client is we did not create the database to begin with. We'll do our best to optimize it with SQL Server, but it's going to take several passes or iterations, right? So the first pass, we use SSMA to upsize the database, which I believe is still the best tool out there to do that, SQL Server Migration Assistant. Then we'll run the application against SQL Server, the reports and the forms, and we fix any glaring issues. Then we give it to the client to say, okay, we did our first pass, now you run it. You tell us which ones you want us to optimize any further. Forms, reports, processes that take too long. And, we do several rounds of that until they're happy or they run out of money. And I'm very clear about this with them. I said, look, you know, there is a return on investment that diminishes over time. So as you ask me to optimize the database, I can do only so much before it just becomes too expensive or prohibitive to optimize it even further, because at that point I already tried the obvious stuff. I already tried indexes, I already tried store procedures, views, CTEs, and you know, when I start getting into compile versions, I call this, Ben does this all the time. You know how you can create a compile version into a SQL Server database of a store procedure? I mean, he can really optimize the hell out of it if he had an unlimited budget. But basically, what I'm trying to point is, you know, it's not a science. It's just rounds of optimization.
Thank you.
So when you tell me, how do I tell if one store procedure is better than the other? I mean, there's so many possibilities and issues that might affect it. Is it running on SQL Server Express? Is it using table memory variables, or is it using the TempDB? Is it using CTEs? Is it using compound views? Are the views themselves have the proper indexes? I mean, there's so many issues that can affect performance that's not even funny. I've always debated in the back of my mind starting a SQL Server University for Access developers, where I offer 3 days of intensive training. At the end of the 3 days, you graduate as a certified Access with SQL Server developer. I always had that in the back of my mind, 3 days of intensive training.
Yeah, I like that. I found that there's a lot of information on SQL Server, but there's a limited amount of information on Access with SQL Server, and it can be difficult to Google it out because I get a lot of, shall we say, pure SQL Server results. And just finding those that relate to Access with SQL Server is, yeah, difficult.
Yeah, and that's why I started the blog, because when I'll tell you how I first started. I bought a book on Access with SQL Server that was done for SQL Server 2000. And if you don't have that book in your library, I urge you to go buy it. It's just a wonderful book that I read cover to cover. Are you guys familiar with what I'm talking about?
What was the title of that?
All right, hold on a second. Let me get that for you. It's an older book, but it's still very much relevant. And I always said that I should write a book to bring it up to speed. Let's see here. Here it is. Client SQL Server Programming as an integrated guide for programmers and developers. July 1997. And so this was one of the books. There's another one, I believe. Let's see if I can find you a more recent one. Here, this is the more recent one. Microsoft Access Developer Guide SQL Server, and this was 2000. So this is 14 years old, and I still have this in my library, and I consult with it on a regular basis. Just a wonderful book. But I've always debated in the back of my mind, create a more recent version, and the publishers don't want to do it because they think there's no market for it. And I disagree, of course. I think there's a worldwide market, but just a wonderful way to get. Mary Chipman is the author with Andy Barron, and just a wonderful book. I mean, it's a thick book. It's probably 2 inches thick. Just on Access Developer with developing with Access and SQL Server. So
is that Access as Access databases or Access projects?
No, Access databases and projects. It does have a chapter on projects. So, you know, when I read this book and I started down this journey, I too realized also the lack of resources out there. That's when I decided to start the blog. And the blog has in turn led to a lot of business for us, so I've been blessed. And helping back to the community has also brought me back rewards with new clients and new work. So please buy this book if you haven't done so already. You're not going to regret it. A lot of the information is not a lot of information is still relevant. Some of it is still is obsolete, such as Access data projects are no longer supported in 2013. But you know, I still think it's worthwhile for you to buy it.
I'll definitely take a look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's that one. And maybe one day you'll see Juan Soto's guide to access the SQL Server and my mugshot on the cover.
Yeah, I'd buy that too.
Oh boy. So look, I want to wrap this up. So thank you so much. If you like this presentation, please speak up. Go to a login access group. Oh, by the way, I promised you I would tell you where the files were that you can download. All these files are available to you. Just go to AccessUserGroups.org. Click on the SQL Server SQL Server with Access group. And next Tuesday, by the way, I'm talking about how to secure your Access database. You know, with Sony being hacked, and before that, Target, Home Depot. It's a very relevant discussion, how to secure your Access, your SQL Server database. So please keep an eye out for that. But if you click on blog here, creating dashboards in Microsoft Access, you'll see that you'll see all the files here in this Northwind dash that you need. You're going to get the Microsoft Access database, which is this one. You're going to get the SQL Server database, which is over here. And then some text files with the store procedure. Just for the date map alone, it's worthwhile download, just to get the date map by itself. So if you need this link, I'm going to copy it to the comments section of WebEx here. Let me do that now. Annotate. No, let's see. Where do I put comments here? Lucy, where do I put comments? Oh, here. Let's see. Ambers, do you have your own practice or do you work for somebody?
I work for somebody, but I might as well. I'm independent in that I'm pretty much the only one in my company that does any Access development.
Okay. So the reason I say that is that, you know, this is going to be very rewarding if you had an Access practice. So let me see, how do I text you guys the notes? Change role to, oh, here it is, chat. So I'm going to chat with everybody, and I'm going to put that link in there. So please tweet that you love the presentation. Go to LinkedIn.com. I have a LinkedIn group for as well as Ambers. So please consider joining our group on LinkedIn and how much you loved the presentation. And so let me bring that up here. And also tweet about it if you have a Twitter account. And join us next Tuesday where we talk about securing your Access application and with SQL Server database. Excuse me. And it's been a pleasure for me being here today. I appreciate the invite, Ambers, and look forward to doing this again later on this year.
To having you again next year or later this year. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I'll see you in the spring. Thank you for the presentation today.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. So long.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Just wrap this up, and we had Juan Soto presenting to us today on using SQL Server to create a snappy dashboard. If you missed the last meeting, you don't have to worry about it because you can find the recordings at AccessUserGroups.org/Europe. Just click the videos and you can see all our previous meetings there. That said, we really do appreciate you showing up to the meetings. It's much more encouraging for us to continue to create content if there's people there. And we love it when people ask questions. Don't hesitate to ask questions. It's much more engaging to have an active audience. Don't be afraid to look stupid. There's no bad questions. A quick something about Access Europe, in case this is your first time joining or viewing. Access Europe is an online user group. It's free to join. There's absolutely no cost involved. We have monthly meetings. We meet the first Wednesday of the month at 9 o'clock Central European Time. And you might wonder why you want to join a user group. Well, if you've been watching this presentation, you'll notice that we've been asking questions. We've been learning stuff. I have asked a lot of questions. Ben asked a lot of questions. And we even asked some questions that made the presenter himself realize that there was something he didn't know. And I often feel that way when I'm presenting. People will ask questions. That's why I do these presentations. I actually want the questions because the questions help me to improve my knowledge. The discussions can be really rewarding for everyone. And I'm part of other user groups, and I love when we have our discussions. I love seeing what other people are showing. So I have some plans for the next meeting, which is going to be February 4th for the Access Europe user group. And I think I'm going to try a different agenda than we've been having for our first meetings. I want to start this time with a Q&A session. So if you have a simple question, even an advanced question, email it to me at thesmilecoder@gmail.com, and I'll pick through the questions, see if I can find some good ones, and answer them directly at the next meeting. And if there's any time left, I'm going to present on change tracking in Access memo fields. If you have any questions or comments, now would be the time.
I think I'll see if I can dream up some for the next meeting.
That would be very good. I would love to have some questions. It's going to be very tame if no one comes with questions.
Yeah, I'll see what I can find.
You can subscribe. If you go to AccessUserGroups.org/Europe and create an account there, you will be notified by email whenever we have a meeting. It's a good reminder. You can put it in your calendar as well. And if we post something like videos or updates, you will get an email with that as well, and we promise we will not spam you with stupid information.
Yeah, I remember. Actually, just thinking, Anders, I saw the video for the ribbon tutorial, the last one we did. Were there any supporting files for that?
I know I promised to do supporting files, and I never got around to it. It's a bit embarrassing. I'll try to see if I can get it done. Around the same time as the last ribbon presentation, I moved my project to SQL Server, my active application, and that's just, it's been a mixed experience.
Is that the first one you've done?
It's the first project I've migrated to SQL Server.
Yeah.
I have another project that I started a couple of months earlier, which is on SQL Server, but it's much more simple in terms of what it does. The active application is about tracking reviews, and there's a lot of stuff going on whenever a review is issued. Kind of like when an order is processed, you have a lot of stuff you want to wrap in a transaction, a lot of stuff going on with recording that now the item was sent, now it has to be removed from inventory, all that sort of stuff. And it's not that it's a big problem doing it in SQL Server, it's just enough different to be a bit of a learning curve.
I guess you
but on the other
triggers and such like, don't you?
I haven't really gotten into triggers yet. I probably should. Right now I'm using mostly stored procedures to do the stuff and calling them from Access.
Yeah, that's the method I use most of the time. Once you get into it, it's pretty quick actually. In my experience, I really am. You do that all the time these days, but when you first get into it and getting used to building the SQL databases with all the stored procs to update and delete and insert and everything else, it can be quite time consuming. getting your head around that to begin with, but it will get quicker.
Yeah, I've already been improving quite a bit, but the beginning was very tough because I've started with SQL Server and I know next to nothing about it. I know SQL from basically just SQL I know from Access, but starting to use SQL Server, and so there's queries, but they don't get stored as in the same way that your queries get stored in Access, and then you have views, which are kind of, I think, kind of similar as to how we have queries in Access, or stored queries in Access. And then there's stored procedures, and there's user-defined functions. Like, I don't even really know what the difference is between user-defined functions and stored procedures. When I started, I'm like, I don't even know which bit of it I should look into.
Yeah, they're all kind of interlinked, aren't they? It's just the terminology you have to get your head around.
Yeah, and when you don't know where to start, it's daunting.
But it's like anything, you start small and build upwards. Once I started to get my head around it, what I needed to do, because I don't know what you do, but I always use unbound forms in Access, and I use everything via, I've got stored procs on the SQL side to update and delete and select records from the tables, and on the Access side, I just use class modules that basically connect to SQL Server and then execute those stored procs. And building up an application from scratch obviously can be quite time-consuming to build all the stored procedures on the SQL side and then build all the class modules. So I managed fairly early on to come up with some scripts to do a lot of that hard work for me. What I do when I first connect to SQL, I populate a local access table with a list of all these SQL Server tables and all the SQL Server columns and all the SQL Server stored procedures. So I've got that information in Access, and then I have some scripts in Access that generate all the VBA class modules to activate and create the stored procedures in SQL. So that saves me a hell of a lot of time. What it means is that when I start from scratch, I can have a lot of the basic plumbing, maybe 70%, 80% of the basic plumbing in place within maybe an hour of starting up just by running some of these scripts, which is pretty handy. If you want, I could happily send you samples to give you some ideas.
Well, I'd be happy to have samples, but I also say that I know there's a lot of religion on bound versus unbound forms, but I'm definitely in the bound camp. I mean, I think that's the main thing that Access gives us is the bound forms. I very rarely come across good reasons, in my opinion, to not use a bound form.
Yeah. So I was looking at a couple of websites and I was getting conflicting advice from different people. So I just tried one method out once I figured out how to build all the scripts up. I felt it was a shame not to use them.
And I want to say there's 100 ways to skin a cat, and
that's right.
I don't want to say that one method is necessarily better than the other, and you should use what works for you as long as it keeps working.
Yeah. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Definitely.
Ben's still on the phone. Sorry, guys. I didn't realize this conversation was going to continue, but I'm going to have to drop out. I would really like to be in part of this conversation because I have things to say and questions to ask about Access and your feelings about SQL Server direction. But can you just tell me how long this meeting was going to go for?
Well, I think most of the other meetings have been about an hour, but I think in general I try to set off an hour and a half for them, just in case.
Okay. Okay. So this is not a new meeting. This is a continuation of your last meeting.
Yeah, we're just chatting.
This is just a cheap way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I wish I could participate, but I got to move on. So thanks for hosting today.
Thank you for coming, Ben.
Okay.
Good questions.
Thanks. Okay.
Cheers.
Bye. Cheers.
Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to stop the recording.
Yeah.